Hello, this is Niswander and welcome to the NOWMAN show. Joining us today is Dr. Peter Dreier, who is an American urban policy analyst, and E.P. Clapp, Distinguished Professor of Politics at Occidental College, where he is also the chair of the Urban and Environmental Policy Department. Originally from New Jersey, he received his BA from Syracuse in 1970, later PhD at the University of Chicago in 1977. He moved to Massachusetts, where he served as Director of Housing at the Boston Redevelopment Authority. For 9 years, he was a senior policy advisor to Boston Mayor Ray Flynn. Professor Dreier has been involved in urban policy as a scholar, government official, and advocate for over 30 years. Professor Dreier is the co-author of 3 books, including books about cities and urban policy, like The Next Los Angeles, The Struggle for a Livable City. He regularly writes on American politics, housing policy, community development, and community organizing. His writings have appeared in the Los Angeles and the New York Times, American Prospect, The Nation, and the Huffington Post, and more. His latest book is titled The 100 Greatest Americans of the 20th Century, a Social Justice Hall of Fame. Peter Dreier, welcome to the NOWMAN show.
Great. Good to be here.
Now, first of all, Social Justice Hall of Fame. How did you come up with that and picking those 100 people?
Well, the history of America is a history of protest and dissent and challenging the establishment. But a lot of the figures who were prominent in those movements, the labor movement, the environmental movement, the women's suffrage and women's rights movement, movements for community improvement in the cities during the early 1900s, up through today with Black Lives Matter and the movement for like Occupy Wall Street. The heroes and the heroines of those movements are not always well known. And so I wanted to write a book that helped us understand that we all stand on the shoulders of the people that came before us, who helped to make this a more livable and a humane country. And so the book celebrates those people and the movement that they were part of.
And you cover literally in a timeline, fashion, and a lot of people that we know by name. But it's interesting how a lot of people may not know the specific details that you put in your book there. Like, for instance, Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt, and we know who these people are, but there's a lot of details that people didn't necessarily get in school. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, there's a couple of, I like to tell stories about some of these people. And some of them are famous people about whom we don't know very much. And some of them are people that are not famous who we should know more about. So Franklin Roosevelt is president of the United States, one of the greatest presidents that ever lived. But people don't know that the relationship between he and Eleanor was one of, he was the public figure in office, but she was often the brains behind the New Deal. And she was the radical in the family. And so, for example, when A. Philip Randolph, the civil rights leader, was threatening to hold a march on Washington in 1941 of 100,000 African Americans to demand that the Army and that the arms industry integrate and provide jobs for African Americans, Franklin did not want to meet with him.
Oh, wow.
But Eleanor was good friends with A. Philip Randolph and had played a role in the civil rights movement in the 30s, and she insisted that that Franklin meet with him, and that led to the first law to ban racial discrimination in the military. Some people don't know that Eleanor Roosevelt was very close to a guy named Miles Horton, who's also in the book, who was the founder of this radical community and labor organizing school in rural Tennessee called the Highlander Center. And it was at the Highlander Center that a lot of the civil rights activists like Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks got trained on how to be activists.
Really?
And so Eleanor Roosevelt played a very important role in building grassroots movements that later became part of our culture, but she's not well known for that. And she was radicalized by the labor movement and the settlement house movement in New York in the early 1900s when she saw immigrant women workers struggling to make ends meet. And she grew up in an upper class family, but she was very sympathetic to the lives of mostly poor women, and that helped to radicalize her. Another good example of somebody who's famous, but not famous for being radical, is Helen Keller.
Yeah.
Helen Keller was famous for being blind.
Yeah.
But she also had a social vision. She was a feminist. She was a socialist.
Yes.
She was a pacifist. She was an outspoken speaker. She was one of the most famous people in the world.
Yes, she was.
Back in the early
very well loved.
Yes, and
everywhere.
very well loved.
Yeah.
And in the early 1900s, she starred in a movie about herself, a silent movie called Deliverance.
I remember that.
And in that movie, you know, she tells a story about her life and growing up. And what we mostly remember about Helen Keller is that scene in The Miracle Worker where she's at the well and she's learning how to say the word water. And that's what, you know, she's famous for. But in this movie about her, that scene is reproduced. But what's also not known is that the workers at the movie theater were on strike during the opening of that movie. And she had to make a decision. Do I go to the opening of the movie about myself, starring myself, or do I stand with the workers who were on strike and picketing? And she decided to go outside the movie theater and picket with the workers. And that brought a lot of attention to their plight, to their struggle, to their cause, and caused the movie theater owner to settle with the workers and their union very quickly. And so Helen Keller is one of those figures that we don't know enough about.
What about Cesar Chavez?
Cesar Chavez was a remarkable figure. He was discovered, so to speak, by a guy named Fred Ross, who was a community organizer, who knocked on his door and met him and sort of got a sense that Cesar Chavez could be a leader. And before he was the leader of the farm workers movement, he had been the leader of a statewide organization in California called the Community Service Organization, which was a community organizing group like ACORN used to be, and groups like that. And he got engaged in voter registration drives. He was one of the first groups to fight about racial discrimination by cops against Mexican Americans in San Jose and Oakland and in LA. And so today we have Black Lives Matter leading the fight against police brutality and police misconduct. But 40 years ago, Cesar Chavez was doing the same thing in the Latino community in California. And one other figure that everybody knows, Dr. Seuss.
Yeah.
You know, the famous cartoonist.
Yeah, he was amazing.
Children's book
didn't
author,
one of, was it Cat in the Hat that he only used 50 words in that whole book?
He was brilliant, yes.
And the way he could communicate to young audiences was just incredible.
And what a lot of people don't know about Dr. Seuss, his real name was Theodor Geisel, was that he was a radical.
Yeah.
And before he wrote children's books, he had been a cartoonist for a left-wing newspaper in New York called PM, where he made fun of racists and demagogues and Hitler and senators who were segregationists. And then he began writing children's books. And he wasn't successful at first, but almost all of his children's books have some kind of political or moral message. And my favorite one is called Yertle the Turtle, which is based on Hitler, which is Yertle is this dictator who tries to persuade all the other turtles to do his bidding, and they pile up on top of each other so that Yertle can see his whole empire. Then a young turtle named Mac coughs, and the whole turtle pipeline comes tumbling down, and Yertle falls off his throne into the mud with the other turtles, and they kind of realize he's just a turtle like the rest of us. And it's really it's a metaphor about power.
Yes.
Right? That it's kind of like the Wizard of Oz. You know, people portray the powerful as powerful until you see that they're just human beings who can be defeated and can be uprooted, and so that's what Dr. Seuss was saying in Yertle the Turtle, that you can fight power, you can fight various forms of oppression, and at the end of the book he says that all human beings, as well as turtles, should be free.
Yes.
And he does that in a number of his other books.
But he also shows in like even the very famous How the Grinch Stole Christmas, how, you know, even the most unlikable person can have a change.
Yes.
A dramatic
Yes.
change.
His major thing, when he was interviewed late in life, he said, they asked him, like, what's been the theme of your life and your art? He says, I don't like people that push other people around.
Yeah.
And you can see that theme in all of his children's books. And so he is the most popular children's writer in the history of the world, more than the Grimm brothers or anybody else. And a lot of people don't know that a lot of those messages are subtle and subliminal, but an entire generation, perhaps even the entire 60s generation, can be accounted for in part by the fact that they grew up listening and being read to about Dr. Seuss's books, and they came to that understanding of challenging arbitrary and unfair authority. And we owe that to Dr. Seuss.
Absolutely. I really respect that a lot.
Yeah.
Another person I really respect a lot, Harvey Milk.
Harvey Milk was the first out gay public official, elected official of the United States, in San Francisco, not surprisingly. And he was a remarkably charismatic person. He ran for office many times before he eventually won. And he basically told people, young gay people, to come out of the closet, that we're not going to really fight discrimination and homophobia unless we're willing to be ourselves. And once he got elected to public office, he used that as a platform to battle not just prejudice and discrimination against gay and lesbian people, but against others. He was also very strongly pro-union. In the early 1970s, the labor movement was organizing a boycott against Coors beer.
Oh, really?
Because Coors beer was funding a lot of right-wing anti-labor activities all over the country. And there were a lot of gay bars in San Francisco. And so Harvey Milk, to support the labor movement's boycott of Coors beer, went around and got almost all the gay bars in San Francisco to boycott Coors beer.
Amazing.
And so when he ran for city council, he not only had the support of the gay community, he had the support of the labor movement. And there's a movie about him called The Times of Harvey Milk, where they interview one of the leaders of one of the movements, a white blue-collar union activist, and he says, in the movie, he says, I don't care whether he's green or blue or gay, he's pro-union, so we stood by him, and so he really was a bridge builder and an important figure. Then, of course, tragically, he was killed by another city council member named Dan White, and his death really was a galvanizing moment in San Francisco and national politics. And since then, we've now had almost every state in the country has at least one out of the closet gay elected official. We have gay members of Congress. We have gay politicians.
Legalized marriage now.
Yes, yeah.
It's just phenomenal. Who would have thought?
Absolutely.
In 2016, we'd be having this conversation.
That's right. Yeah. And that's a good example. One of the people in my book is a guy named Harry Hay, who was the founder of the first gay rights organization in the United States called the Madison Society, founded in 1950 in Los Angeles. In 1950.
Oh, here in L.A.
Here in Los Angeles.
Wow.
And Harry Hay had been a left-wing community organizer, labor activist, in the closet, of course. And then he decided he didn't want to be in the closet anymore. And he knew a lot of gay men. And so he formed this secret organization called the Madison Society. And eventually they began to challenge the activities of the LA Police Department for harassing gay men. They began to, in the courts, began to litigate for gay rights. And when the gay rights movement blossomed after the Stonewall riots in New York in the late 1960s, people didn't know about Harry Hay. And then he sort of made a comeback in the 70s as a kind of elder statesman of the gay rights movement. But he's still not well known among even a lot of gay activists. And so in my book, I celebrate him as one of those people on whose shoulders we all stand for the incredible achievements of the gay rights movement, including, as you were saying, the remarkable accomplishment of legalizing same-sex marriage.
Let's see if we can get some short, quick comments about some people here. So start with Muhammed Ali.
There are 3 athletes in my book who use their athletic prowess and fame as a platform for speaking out about social and economic injustice. One of them was Jackie Robinson, who broke baseball's color line.
And he's born and raised from here in Pasadena,
California. He was born in Georgia, but he grew up in Pasadena.
Ah, okay.
Another one was Billie Jean King, who was probably the greatest tennis player that ever lived, but jeopardized, sacrificed some of her fortune as an athlete in order to come out first for women's rights, for telling people in the 70s that she had had an abortion, and then later coming out as a lesbian, and organizing women athletes and women tennis players into a women's tennis league, demanding equal pay for women athletes as well as men athletes in tennis. And then Muhammad Ali, who was a remarkable figure, just died recently, because he was not well educated. He grew up in Louisville, Kentucky. He was not someone who anybody thought would become a human rights activist.
Right.
But he became more politicized, particularly by Malcolm X, who was his mentor. And he became what became known as a black Muslim. And he became a very religious person. And when the war in Vietnam was being fought, he refused to be drafted.
Yeah.
And he gave up and they took away his heavyweight crown. He lost 3 years of earnings, which is millions and millions of dollars at the peak of his career. But he stuck by his principles. And he continued to do so. He made a living by speaking on college campuses and so forth. But he lost a lot of money, millions of dollars, for his principles. And what was amazing is he was extremely controversial, particularly when he changed his name from Cassius Clay to Muhammad Ali. A lot of sports writers refused to use the name that he chose for himself. It took quite a while before they would do that. And then towards the end of his life, he became kind of a celebrity. He became somebody that everybody admired for his courage and his principles. And even to the point where in 1996 he was chosen to light the torch at the Olympics in Atlanta. Nobody would have thought that would have happened to Cassius Clay, Muhammad Ali, when he was a controversial figure resisting the draft.
Exactly.
And so Muhammad Ali was a remarkable figure. Many people know him now as one of the greatest boxers in history, but was also one of the great human rights, civil rights, outspoken anti-war leaders in the country during the 1970s.
How about John Lewis?
There are two John Lewises in the book. There's John L. Lewis, who was the leader of the labor movement in the 30s and had been
AFL-CIO creator, right?
And yes, he led the CIO, which was a break-off from the mainstream labor movement, the more radical wing of the labor movement. He'd been a leader of the Mine Workers Union. But the one you're probably referring to is the congressman from Atlanta, Georgia, an African-American who grew up on a farm. He grew up pretending to be Martin Luther King. He used to give sermons to the chickens on his farm, practicing public speaking. And then he went to Fisk University in Nashville, where he got involved with the civil rights movement and risked his life engaging in civil disobedience. He was almost killed many times, once on a freedom ride on a bus, getting off a bus of the freedom rides in 1961, and another time when he and Martin Luther King led the march on Selma, which was the subject of the movie in which John Lewis is portrayed. And then he went into politics. A lot of people think when you go into politics, you give up your principles. He never did. He remained a principled activist radical. He's been one of the leaders of the fights for civil rights, for gay rights, for immigrant rights. In June of this year, he led a sit-in on the floor of the U.S. House of Representatives, where almost all the Democrats joined him. So he was once again a community organizer inside the House of Representatives on behalf of challenging the Republicans to introduce and vote on a gun control law. This was after the Orlando massacre.
Oh, wow. Just recently.
Just recently. And he got fed up with Republicans stifling any debate, much less filing a bill to limit gun ownership and the sale of guns and ammunition. And so he led a sit-in, which he had been doing all his life. But this was among his fellow members of Congress. And it was remarkable that to see my own members of Congress, Adam Schiff and Judy Chu here from the Pasadena area, sitting in on the floor of the U.S. House led by John Lewis. So he's a remarkable figure who has been consistent his entire life in fighting for human rights and equality.
And you even have musicians in the book, like Bob Dylan, Joan Baez, Woody Guthrie, and Bruce Springsteen.
Yeah. Yes, I mean, the book is divided into sort of three groups of people. One are organizers and activists, who sort of build the movements from the bottom up, like Eugene Debs, like Martin Luther King, like John Lewis, like Betty Friedan of the women's movement, and others going back to the early 1900s. And then there are politicians and judges, Supreme Court judges. There are 3 Supreme Court judges in the book, and people that ran for office like Paul Wellstone and Franklin Roosevelt and Eugene Debs, who ran for president but never won. And then the third group of people are artists and musicians and writers and playwrights like Arthur Miller, and philosophers like Rabbi Heschel, Abraham Joshua Heschel. And the singers and the musicians in the book include, as you said, Woody Guthrie, Pete Seeger, Paul Robeson, the great African-American singer, Bob Dylan, Joan Baez, and Bruce Springsteen. I went to a Bruce Springsteen concert here in Los Angeles a couple of months ago, and he's still singing Woody Guthrie songs. He's still singing about the plight of the working class. He's still using his fame and fortune as a platform for social justice. He recently refused to do a concert. He backed out of a concert in North Carolina in protest of their anti-gay discrimination law that the state government passed. And so he's still fighting the fight, and his heroes were Pete Seeger and Woody Guthrie.
That's fantastic. Yeah. And there's also the less known or maybe unknown people in the book. What are some of your favorites in that area? There's some women there.
Yes. Well, one of my favorite sort of lesser known people is a woman named Charlotte Perkins Gilman.
Yes.
Who was a feminist, a suffragette, a radical, a socialist.
Very radical too.
Yes. Who early in the 1900s basically wrote about the inequality of gender in America, and wrote probably 10 books about the economics of the family, about discrimination against women in the workplace, and basically said we have to rethink gender roles.
Exactly.
And that women and men should be equally responsible for raising their children, that women should have employment, that should be able to go to college. She was kind of a utopian, but she was also active in the women's suffrage movement. And she was a well-known speaker. She traveled all over the country. She had big audiences. She was kind of the Gloria Steinem of her day.
Yeah.
And she was a socialist and a feminist.
And she also lived at the Hull House, right, which was a settlement house created by another person in your book, Jane Addams.
Yes.
So another incredible woman. I mean, I'm fascinated with the subject of settlement houses. Can you talk to us more about Jane Addams and settlement houses?
Right. So Jane Addams came from a wealthy family in Illinois. In the late 1800s, she was one of the first women of her generation to go to college. But there was no outlet for their education because they were discriminated against in employment. And so either you became you became a housewife, or you became a volunteer.
Yeah.
And she wanted to do something else. She just didn't want to do that. So she bought a house in the immigrant working class section of Chicago called the Hull House. And she brought her friends and other people, upper class, mostly women, and they were the first generation of community organizers.
And they basically, people from different economic stratas were all together experiencing this.
Yes, so they lived in the slums, but they came from different economic backgrounds, and it was the upper middle class women that provided the money, but they also recruited working class women to live at the Hull House, and then they did things like they fought for the minimum wage for women. In the early, they fought for protections for women at the work that today we call OSHA, Occupational Safety and Health. But there was a woman there named Alice Hamilton who was the first expert on occupational disease. There was a woman who lived there who was the first person who supported, tried to organize consumers to support labor unions. She was friends with Eugene Debs, the great socialist labor organizer in Chicago. And she built this settlement house. It's called a settlement house, where she invited the immigrants in. They also taught them English. They taught them how to paint. They taught them how to be better parents. They taught them other skills that and they taught them organizing.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
And then that inspired other people to do the same thing. So this was in the late 1800s, 1880s, within 20 years, there were settlement houses like Hull House in every city in the country, including here in Los Angeles.
Wow.
And they became leaders, activists in a lot of the great movements for social justice. And we now think of Jane Addams, if anybody knows about her at all, we think of her as the mother of social work. But it turns out she was also a socialist.
Yes.
She was also anti-war. She started something called the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. She was the founder of the American Civil Liberties Union.
Wow.
She was a founder of the of the NAACP, the first major civil rights organization. She was a one-woman social movement.
And Theodor Roosevelt, actually, if he was running for president on the Progressive Party at the time, and if he would have won, he would have put her in his cabinet.
Yeah,
probably.
absolutely, yes.
You know,
and she was the first
phenomenal
yes.
woman.
Yes.
I mean, just,
right, and the first woman to win the Nobel Peace Prize.
Really?
Yes.
Wow, that's incredible.
Yeah.
And Florence Kelly?
Florence Kelly lived at Hull House
Yeah.
and was one of the people that built bridges between the immigrant community
Yes.
and the upper middle class supporters of the labor movement and organized labor. And she was, again, the woman that in Illinois started the movement for a minimum wage.
Yes. And then that eventually also be enacted for men, too.
Yes.
But
yes.
it started with women.
Started with
I did not know that until I read your book.
Yeah. The first minimum wage was a feminist idea.
That's fantastic.
That's right.
Well, Peter, obviously we could go on and on and on, but this has been phenomenal. Thank you so much for being on the program.
Sure, my pleasure.
Peter Dreier, you are watching the NOWMAN Show, and my name is Niswander.